In this part of lesson 5, we're talking about functions, and we finally get to do something fun with JavaScript. In the previous videos, previous lessons, we've been talking about the rather mundane parts of JavaScript, things that you can't really do much with. But when we combine all of those concepts with functions, we have limitless possibilities that we can have with JavaScript. Of course, there's other things, but like I said, in this video series, I'm taking you through the most important parts. We're not going into the super fine details yet. We're going to do that through practice problems and through real-world practice. We're going to fill in those gaps there. So again, we're talking about functions in this video, and the first way that I want to start this out is by writing out a basic function. So here is how we write a function in JavaScript. We're going to say my function. So if you notice, this is kind of similar to what we've been doing with the if statements, the conditionals, and the loops. We have some sort of keyword at the beginning. Then we have, well, this is different. We have a name of the function, and then we have a parentheses. So it's kind of similar syntax, and then we have these brackets here where our code will go. So with the function, we have to give it a name here. And in the parentheses, we don't actually have to put anything in there. We'll talk about that in just a second. Let's go ahead and print something. Hello world, this is my first function. We're going to end that statement with the semicolon and press enter. And what you'll notice is that it doesn't do anything. And this is different from what we've talked about with some of the previous concepts where everything happens at once. So remember, if we, declare a variable, set it equal to 20, something like that, when we press enter, the variable is declared and it's assigned at the same time. And with functions, what's happening is we break out those steps into two steps. So up here, what we've done is we've declared the function. But what we haven't done is called this function, or what we call invoked this function. Those are kind of synonymous terms. In order to do that, we just grab the name of the function, which, as you can see, similar to this variable, this my function word right here, this is just a variable that the computer remembers. So since the computer remembers it, since we already declared it, it's going to recognize it when we type it out. So if we said type of my function, it's going to give us function because it remembers what that is. And to execute this, so I'm kind of using all these different words, to execute a function, to call a function, and to invoke a function. For our purposes, they are all the same thing. So anyways, we call the function using these two parentheses right here and a semicolon. And when we press enter, it's going to say, hello world, this is my first function because it ran the code within the function. So just to review, with functions, you first have to declare it, and then you have to call, invoke, or execute it, all the same kind of terminology. Now, there is one way that we can declare and call the function in the same step. And although you're not going to use these all that often, I do want to show you them just so that you have an awareness of them. And what these are called is an immediately invoked function. So let's say that we write another function, so another function here, and we enter down, we say console.log, hello. Now, if we pressed enter, this is going to just declare it. But all we have to do is wrap this entire function in some parentheses, and then put our parentheses that we use to call it at the end, semicolon, and you're going to get this function to declare and execute at the same time. Obviously, the computer does it in different steps, but for our purposes, it's happening all at once. This is what we call an immediately invoked function. And like I said, you're not going to use this a ton, but just be aware of it. You might see it pop up in some Stack Overflow answers, or you might even use it at some point. So we got a basic function, but it's not useful. Like, what are you going to do with the function that we just wrote? Obviously, there's more to it. And the thing that I want to introduce next is the concept of parameters and arguments. And what I would say with these two terms is they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And once you get into more advanced programming, Programmers are probably going to be using these parameters and arguments terms interchangeably because, like I said, they're two sides of the same coin. But for our purposes, we're going to distinguish between these. So let's write a function. We'll say my function again, and we'll enter down onto a new line. Now, what I want to do to add into this parenthesis is going to be something called a parameter. Now, these parameters are basically saying to the computer, hey, computer, I'm going to pass in some sort of values into this function, so be ready for them. So basically what I'm going to say to this function is, hey, I'm going to pass in some number, and then I'm going to pass in some string value. Now, obviously, with JavaScript, it's a dynamically typed language, so you don't have to say like some number or some string. This is just an example. Maybe we could even say something like param1 and param2. So let's just go with that. These are arbitrary names that we have. And then what I want to do is console.log param1, and then we'll go on to a new line. Oh, I accidentally messed that up. Let me go ahead and try this once more. Oh, we really messed up here. Okay. 1 second. Let's refresh the browser. Clear it out. And then we need to enter to a new line and console.log param2. All right. So what we're doing here is we're taking the value of param1 and the value of param2, which in this case, within the function, these are variables. These are variables that we can retrieve the value from and print out. So we're going to declare that function. Well, as you can see, it's a little bit later in the day here, so I had to take a break, but getting back to what we were talking about with these parameters. So the question is, what are they equal to? What is param1 and param2 equal to? Well, the answer to that is we don't know yet. And we don't know because we haven't assigned them as what we call arguments. So we know that this is a declared function, but we still have to call or invoke it. And to do that, you know how to do that. You just put in the little parentheses at the end and you'd press enter. Now, if we just press enter right now, it's going to return undefined because we didn't pass in any parameters. So when this code tries to execute and it tries to reference these parameter variables, there's no value to grab because we never gave it a value. So to answer the question of what they represent, well, they represent the arguments that you pass into the function. So if we have this function, we can pass in, say, a number and then some string of some sort. And now these are what we call the arguments. Now, like I said, arguments and parameters are kind of the, two sides of the same coin. But in this case, whatever we pass in, the values we pass in are called the arguments, and then the initial variables that we were declaring would be the parameters. So 20 is going to correspond to param1, and then some string is going to correspond to param2. So we should get 20 and then some string printed out when we run this function. Don't worry about this little undefined here. That's just kind of part of the console. We got our 20 and some string printed in order according to the function that we wrote. So that's just a basic overview of arguments and parameters. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is a brief introduction to scopes in JavaScript. So when I say scope, what I'm generally referring to is where these variables are available in the code. So in other words, we noticed that param1 and param2 were used within this function, but if we were to just try to print param1 into the console, it's not going to work. And the reason is param1 is not available in the global scope. It's only available in the function scope, which is any code that's written between these two little brackets right here. So we pass in these values, but these are only available to the function. It's not available to the rest of the code that you're writing in the file or the console that you're writing the code in. So that's just a basic introduction to scopes. There's a lot to this topic, and as I said, we're not trying to cover every last detail of JavaScript. That's something that I think you'll have to fill in kind of outside of this tutorial, and as we do practice problems and get into some more like real world examples, you'll start to understand these scopes, and I'll try to, point them out as we go through. Like I said, the You Don't Know JavaScript series is a great way to get a super deep dive into things, topics like the topic of scopes, but beware, it's very complicated and there will be a lot of confusion if you kind of go down that route. Up until this time, I've shown you how to write a function as we see on the screen right now, but there is actually another way to write a function. And let me show you how that's done. So let's go ahead and clear this, this console. And we'll create a function just like we are used to creating. So no parameters going in there, just a basic function, and we'll console.log something. All right, so that's our basic function. Now another way that we could write this is by assigning it to a variable. So in this case, the myFunction variable is already defined and it represents a function, so we can't use that in our variable declaration, but we can say something like another function, and then we want to set that equal to a function. So this is just a normal variable, and all we have to do is say function, define it, and we'll console.log another thing. All right. So we set that equal to another function, and if we say type of another function, it's going to give us the type of function. Now I'm saying this word a lot, so I gotta slow down here. But anyways, if we wanted to invoke this function or call it, it works the same way that we were using it before. So just like we call myFunction, just like this, and it prints out something, we can invoke another function the same exact way, even though it is a variable. Now, there are a few little subtle differences between these two ways of writing functions, and like I said, it gets into some details that we're not quite ready for, and I'm just going to leave out for now. It's not, and these details are not essential for you to write good code and get it up and running. They're more like edge cases where your code doesn't work and you can't figure out why. Well, it's because of this subtle nuance. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. All right, so we've got these two different ways. The main difference that I want you to recognize is the fact that this function right here does not have a name. This is what we call an anonymous function. And the reason we can use an anonymous function is because we are assigning it to a variable. So we're giving it a name. Now up here, we just do it all at once. We just give it a name and we're done. So if you tried to write a function without a name, so something like this, you're not going to get it to work because this is an anonymous function and you need to declare some sort of name. And you see the syntax error, it says function statement requires a name. So that is not valid because it's anonymous. You have to assign it to a variable. Now there is another way to write functions, and this is a little bit tricky, but I'd like to cover it because you're going to be using this next type of writing a function a ton. So as of 2015, when the ES6 standard came out, so if you remember back from, I think, lesson 2, we talked about ECMAScript standard and how there's a standards body that basically defines the spec for the JavaScript language. Well, they upgraded that spec in 2015 with ES6, and they came out with something called a arrow function. So that arrow function looks like this. So we'll say arrow function equals, and then we'll put some parentheses. We'll put an arrow, and then write it just like normal. So we'll say I am an arrow function. All right, so we press enter, and like our other functions, we can call it or invoke it the same way. So we just press arrow function with the two parentheses at the end, and boom, it executes. So it's functionally equivalent in a way. Again, there's some subtle nuances that we're not going to get into, but this arrow function is mainly here so it improves readability. And another benefit that it has is it really helps out with the scopes of your code, and specifically the this keyword, which we'll get into much later, but it does improve on that. That's why they came out with it in the first place. So this is a very different way of writing a function, but here's the basic syntax. You just have this little parentheses, which is basically here's where you put the parameters. Then you have this arrow, that's why they call it an arrow function, so an equal sign and then a right caret, or greater than sign. And then you have these two brackets just like you would any function. Once again, you cannot just use this alone. This is kind of similar to that anonymous function we looked at, and you can't just define a function like this and this won't work because it doesn't have a name. So you don't have a name specified. It didn't throw an error like the previous one, but you have no way of referencing back to this. You don't know how to actually call it because there's no name for it. So you have to assign these anonymous functions and arrow functions to some sort of variable. These arrow functions or anonymous functions can also be used in something called a callback, but again, that's going to be a little bit later down the road. All right, from now on, I'm going to be focusing a lot on these arrow functions. I'm going to be writing them for the most part. Now, obviously, if you're defining a function on its own, you have to write it, with the normal syntax. So you have to write it with the name and then the parentheses just like this. But for a lot of cases, we can just assign it to a variable, and I'd like to get you practicing the arrow functions because you're going to use them so much. So the next thing that we're going to talk about here is the concept of return values in functions. So far, we haven't returned anything from our functions, and if we're writing these, so let's say my function, save it to a variable, and use the arrow function syntax, and then we just console.log something. All right, very simple. My function does not actually return anything. So if we were to assign a result variable to it, so we're going to say my function, and then we're going to call it. So remember, this is just executing the function we defined above, and then it's assigning the result of that function to the result variable. So we press enter, and this is just the console.log that was executed as part of the function. But if we type out result, it's going to give us undefined. And the reason is because our function didn't return anything. So if we want our function to produce a value, we have to put a return statement in there. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Return function, that's what I'm going to name it here. That's just a variable. We'll use the arrow syntax. Enter down, and this time we're going to return a value of 20. And we also could have returned, some string, or we also could have returned a variable. So if we wanted to, make a variable called a, and that equals 20. I accidentally hit enter there. But if we wanted to, we could come down here and return a. Now it's going to bug out on me because I've already declared it like right here on accident. So let's refresh the page real quick so that we can get back into this. So we'll just say my function this time. We've got the fat arrow function, enter down. We'll define a variable, set it to 20, and then we will return that variable. Now we could also return like some sort of expression. So what if we wanted to return a is greater than 30, which it's not, obviously. So this would return false. So let's just see, how these different return types affect the function. We're just going to return a, which will be 20, and now we want to set that equal to a result variable. So we'll get my function, we're going to execute it, and then assign the result to that result variable. And now when we print out the result, it's going to equal 20 because it took the result value of the function and assigned it to that variable. Like I said, you can do expressions here. So if we wanted to define another function, we'll just put 2 at the end so it's unique. And then we want to say a is less than 30, which it is. This will return true. I'm just going to put a comment there. And therefore, we would expect that this whole function is going to evaluate this last expression here and then return it. So let's press enter, and then we'll say result2 is equal to my function 2. And then if we get the value, it's going to be true. So you can see that there's a lot of different things that we can return from a function. Heck, we could even return a function from a function, but that's getting into way too much detail and it's not necessary for what we're trying to do. So I'm going to skip that. Hopefully this gives you a brief overview of return values. Now the last thing that we have to talk about is what happens after the return value. So let's say that we had, I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen. We'll say improper return function, and then we're going to set that equal to our arrow function, and we're going to return 20, or no, let's go ahead and set a variable. I messed this up again. It's kind of tough working in the console, but we will eventually get to a code editor, which is going to be a lot easier on us. So let's say my function, do this one more time, and in this case, let's define a variable. So we'll say let my number equal 20, and then we're going to return my number. Now let's enter down onto the next line, and then we'll say my number equals 50. All right, so we're going to press enter, and it's going to give us an error. It says unreachable code after the return statement. You won't get this from all, like this is just in the console. You may not get this error anywhere else, but this is giving us a hint that we've done something wrong here, but it is still valid. So basically what we're saying here is we're going to run the function. It's going to return 20, and that's because we've returned the value before we reassigned it. So this is valid code to write, but it's useless because this last line right here is never going to be reached no matter what happens. It's always going to return beforehand, and you'll never return a value of 50. So just know that for the return values, whatever happens after it doesn't matter, and you pretty much will never have a return value before the end of your function. So let's say that we have a global variable. We'll just say something like my number equals 20. All right, so we're going to set that in the global scope. Again, scopes are going to get important here soon, so just kind of keep that in the back of your head. Now we're going to define a function. So we're going to say, let's go ahead and use let, because in case I screw up again and we have to reassign it. So we're going to go ahead and say my function, and we're going to set that equal to an arrow function. Now we're going to say if my number, so this kind of seems like going against what I told you earlier about scopes. So if there's a parameter that has a function scope, it cannot be accessed at the global level. But if you have a global variable, you can access it from within a function. So it goes one way but not the other when it comes to scopes. So since this is it's in technically a higher scope than the function has, the function can actually recognize what this variable is equal to. So we're going to say if my number, and then we're going to enter down, and actually I need an expression here. If my number is, we'll say, less than 15, then I want to return the function early. All right, and then we're going to enter down, and then we're going to return 40. These are all random numbers I'm making up here, but it's just trying to show you that if you have a condition where, if the number is less than 15, which it is not in this case, you can actually return multiple things from the same function. So my number is not less than 15, so we're going to actually skip this return function and return 40. But if we change that, so let's say we change that to less than 50, and 20 is less than 50, so we're going to actually return this function early, and we'll never reach the second return statement. So let's go ahead and enter that down and execute it, and you'll see that we get that returned the function early output. So you can have multiple return statements within a function, just you can't have like two of them on the same line. So if I were to recreate this function and maybe have, like a return statement of 50 and then return 40 right after it, both of these code paths are going to be reached. So this doesn't make any sense. You only want to return one value. So that's just an overview of return values. We're going to get a lot more into this as we start writing some more realistic code. just wanted to give you a brief overview. The last thing that I want to do prior to getting into the 25 practice exercises or coding challenges I have for you, I want to talk a little bit about objects and functions together. So this is a little bit of a confusing topic, but it's going to hopefully help you understand when we start talking about the built-in functions of JavaScript. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Hopefully this will help you understand that better. So let's go ahead and define a function. We're going to call it my function again. And then let's, return a value of 20 from it. So this is a very simple function. We'll go ahead and execute it just to demonstrate. It returns 20. Now, what if I wanted to set this equal to another variable? I can actually do that even though it's already called my function. So I can say, alias. An alias is just another name for something. So we'll say alias variable equals my function. All right, so if we press enter, now alias variable is exactly equal to this function declaration that we made above. So if we wanted to execute that as alias variable, we're going to get the same answer of 20. So we can assign it to different variables, which means that we can also assign it to object properties. So let's go ahead and clear I guess we don't need to clear the screen. Let's go ahead and create an object. So we'll say my object, and then we'll set that equal to prop1. We'll just give it some random value just to have something there. And then we'll say prop2 is going to be equal to my function. All right, so we have declared my object, and prop2, just a random property name that I've given it, is going to be exactly equal to the function declaration, just like we made this alias variable equal to the function declaration. So what does this mean? Well, we can actually execute the function by accessing a value of, or by accessing a property of the object. So if we come down here and let's just go ahead and say my object, and then we need to get a property from the object. So let's go ahead and get property 2. And you'll see in the autocomplete down here, it's pretty much telling us that that is equal to my function. Now, if we wanted to execute it, we can still put those little parentheses at the end, and it's going to execute and give us the same answer. So what we did here was we grabbed an object, we grabbed a property off of that object using the dot notation, and then once we had that, we just threw those little parentheses at the end and executed it. So I just wanted to get you familiar with this because what we're about to talk about is the built-in functions of JavaScript. So JavaScript has a bunch of built-in functions and objects and all sorts of other stuff that we can use without having to write any code. And if you go to, there's several resources that you can use to see these. I'm on Tutorials Point, which has a good list of them, but they're all over, documented pretty much everywhere. And within JavaScript, there are different data types, as we have talked about. So you have strings, you have booleans, you have numbers, and all of these different data types will actually have some built-in functions that you can call on top of them. So if we go here and just look at some of the different methods, so method is another, synonym for function. We can call it's not completely synonymous, but if you have an object and then you have a function attached to that object as we just showed, that's called an object method. So it's kind of the same thing. And you can see that we have number methods, we have Boolean methods, and we have string methods, and we have array methods probably down here somewhere. So array methods. And depending on the variable type that you're working with, you can use all of these to modify your variables and just take a bunch of shortcuts with your code. So let me go ahead and show you a few of these just to give you an idea of how they work, because when we go into the coding challenges throughout this course, we're going to be using these as much as we can. Now, the first thing I'll say here is don't try to memorize these. These are not to be memorized. There is documentation for a reason so that you can Google it and look it up when you need it. You'll pick up on a few of them over time, but for the most part, I only have a few of these actually committed to memory. All right, so let's go ahead and try out a few string methods. So let's say that we wanted to, I don't know, use this replace method. We go back to the console, let's clear everything out, and let's define ourselves a string. So we'll say my string equals Zach. And then we're going to use the replace method. So maybe I spelled my name wrong. This is how you spell my name, but what if there's a K at the end? So I might want to replace it. So I can say my string dot replace, and then I'm going to replace the H with a K. And when we press enter, it's going to return Zach with a K, and now my string is actually going to still be equal to the original because it didn't replace the value. It just returned a new value. So it doesn't alter the original value here, it just returns a new one. So if we wanted to say new name, we can just say my string dot replace H and K. And then we set that equal to new name, and now my new name is going to be spelled differently. Now, something that I want you to notice when we're looking at this is that we're using the same notation here that we used earlier when we accessed that property of the object and executed it as a function. Now, this works a little bit differently than that, but you can kind of think of it that way. So maybe the my string is considered your object, and then you use dot notation to get a property off of that object called replace, which happens to be a function that takes two parameters. And the first parameter it takes is the letter or string that you want to find within your string. So I want to find the letter H within my string. And then I want to replace it with the string K, just a letter, so my string will be replaced. So these are the parameters, and if you were to look at the replace method and you go ahead and click on it, it gives you a description of this, and we're going to learn how to, read through documentation a little bit later. But anyways, you can go down here and just see what kind of parameters are required for this. So here's the syntax, and it gives you the parameters that you want to search for, then the parameters you want to replace it with, a couple examples, some output, all that stuff. So that's how I've figured out how to use that. Again, we're going to go through it quite a bit as we go through the coding challenges. I'll just go through a couple more examples just to get you comfortable with what's going on here. So let's go ahead and use my string once again. And this time I want to use the string method called toUppercase. And you can see what that does is it returns us the uppercase version of our variable. Now I know we got a lot of different versions going on here, so let's go ahead and clear that out and reprint my string. So that is what my string variable is equal to right now. We can also chain the methods together. So this is a little bit of an odd concept to someone starting out, but you'll see how this actually works once we get into the challenges. So let me just do a simple example here. We have my string equal to Zach, but let's go ahead and say we want a new string or something. So let's call it, I don't know, let's make a new one. We'll just call it str for string. And this one we're going to say hello world in there. So that's the string right there. And what we want to do is first make it uppercase. So we'll say toUppercase, and we'll execute that method that sits on the string object. And that's going to output us hello world, as it's kind of telling us here. Now we can put another dot there, and we can chain these methods on top of each other. So I'm going to use another method called split. And what split does is it's going to take whatever delimiter that you put as a parameter, or not a parameter, as an argument. So if we put in a space right here, it's going to look at the string and it's going to say there's one space in there, so I want to split hello and world apart from each other. And then what it does there, as you can see down here, is it actually changes the data type from a string to an array, where the first part of that array is the hello, and the second is world. So let's set this equal to a variable. We'll just say a result variable is what we want. And our result variable is now an array. And from there, we can actually do array methods. So let's go ahead and go back to the documentation here, and let's scroll down to some of our array methods that we can use. So what would be a good one to use? So we'll use the index of method. So this just basically gives us the index of a value. So we'll say result.index of, and then I want to search for the word world. And when we press enter, it's going to return us 1 because this is an index of 0 and this is an index of 1. And that matches the string that we are searching for that we passed in as an argument to this function. Now, of course, you don't have to do this by chaining them together. You can do it in separate steps. So in the case of above, we made this to uppercase and then we split it into an array in a single step. But if it gets too complex for you and you just want to stick to the basics, you can do this in different steps. So we'll say, first let's see what string is equal to. It's still equal to hello world because while we did this right here, we didn't modify the original variable. We just assigned it to a new one. So string still represents hello world. And in this case, we'll say step1 variable. We want to take that and we want to make it uppercase. All right, so we'll make it uppercase and then maybe just type it out to make sure that it worked. Now we're going to do step 2 right here where we say step 1. So we want to grab whatever values in step 1 and then we want to split that based on a space. All right, so we set that to step 2. And then step 2, we can print out and we see that it's an array. And then we come to, say, step 3. And we'll say step 2, whatever value's in that variable. And then we'll say index of, like we did above. And then we'll search for the word world. And we'll set that to step 3, and we get an index of 1. So you can see we can split these out into different steps, but I just wanted you to know that as you see some different syntax when you're reading through code, this is a valid way to use these built-in methods in JavaScript. All right, there was a lot here. There was a lot going on in this video, and I would never expect you to take it all in at once and process it and understand every last bit of it. And that is why we're going to use a bunch of practice exercises or coding challenges to brush up on these skills and really cement some of the concepts. We've talked about variables, we've talked about operators, we've talked about conditionals, so if else, or else if, doing a tongue twister there. We've talked about loops and we've talked about functions. So there's a lot going on here, and to combine it all together and actually write code, I think it's useful to go through some exercises. So the way we're going to do that is actually through a site called Code Wars. And let me open that up real quick and show you what I'm talking about. So on my screen here is the Code Wars website, and it's basically just a collection of code challenges that you can take in all sorts of different programming languages. The screen that I'm on right here is a collection that is going to be linked in the description of this video on the main page of this course, in the GitHub repo, everywhere you'll find it somewhere. And this collection is a list of 25 exercises that I've chosen based on what we've covered so far. Before you go to the next video for the code challenges, please give a like to this one and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next parts of this series. All right, I'm out. We'll see you in the code challenges.